The bar smelled like spilled beer and fried onions, the kind of smell Sophia Bennett had stopped noticing 3 years ago. She wiped down table 6 with one hand and balanced 2 empty pitchers in the other, her feet aching inside shoes that had given up cushioning months earlier. Friday nights at Hutch's were always loud, always chaotic, and always exactly the same.
"Sophia, get over here!"
She turned toward the voice. Danny and his usual crew of regulars sat clustered around the corner booth, already 3 rounds deep, grinning like they'd just thought of something brilliant. They hadn't. They never did. "What now?" she asked, setting the pitchers down on the bar with a clink.
"We've got a dare for you."
Danny pointed his beer toward a table near the back wall, half hidden in shadow.
"See that guy? Nobody's talked to him all night. Not even Hutch went near him."
Sophia followed his finger. A man sat alone at the corner table, untouched whiskey in front of him, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked wildly out of place in a bar that smelled like onion rings. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't looking at anything, really. Just sitting, still as a photograph, watching the room without seeming to watch it. "So?" she said. "So we dare you to go hug him?" The table erupted into laughter, the kind that came easy after a few drinks. Sophia rolled her eyes, the same tired performance she gave every time these guys tried to drag her into one of their games. She was used to being the punchline, the big waitress with the loud laugh, always good for a dare because everyone assumed she'd say no, or that if she said yes, it'd be funny. "You're all idiots," she said, but she was already untying her apron string with one hand, because turning down a dare in front of a room of regulars who tipped well wasn't worth the awkwardness of explaining why. Besides, what was the worst that could happen? A stranger giving her a confused look, maybe a laugh, and she'd walk back to the bar and forget about it by closing time. She didn't know yet that this single decision would unravel a secret 15 years in the making. Sophia walked toward the back table, feeling the eyes of the bar follow her, feeling her own face go warm with embarrassment. Up close, the man looked even more out of place. His jaw was sharp, his posture too still, like he was carved rather than seated. 2 men stood near the entrance who she'd assumed were just other customers. She now noticed they hadn't ordered a single drink all night, and their eyes were fixed entirely on her as she approached. "Hi," she said, voice quieter than she intended. "This is going to sound strange, but my friends dared me to give you a hug. You don't have to say yes. I'll just go back and tell them you said no, and—" The man looked up at her. His eyes weren't unkind, but they carried a weight she couldn't place, like he'd seen too much for someone his age. "Go ahead," he said simply. Sophia blinked, caught off guard by how calm his voice was. She leaned down, wrapped her arms around him in a brief, awkward hug, the kind meant to last 3 seconds and end the dare. She felt him go rigid beneath her arms, not from discomfort, but like every muscle in his body had locked into alertness. That's when the room changed. Out of the corner of her eye, Sophia saw 3 men rise from different parts of the bar, moving fast and silent, hands already drifting toward their jackets. She hadn't noticed them before. Nobody had. They moved like shadows that had been waiting all night for a reason to become real. Her heart slammed into her throat. She pulled back instinctively, stumbling half a step, certain she'd done something terribly wrong. But the man raised one hand, just slightly, fingers barely lifting off the table. The 3 men stopped instantly, like puppets whose strings had gone still. They melted back into the bar's shadows as quickly as they'd appeared, and within seconds, it was as if nothing had happened at all. The chatter around them resumed. Someone laughed at the pool table. The jukebox kept playing the same country song it had been playing all night. Sophia stood frozen, pulse hammering, trying to process what she'd just seen. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "You didn't do anything wrong," the man said, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression. The stillness cracked, just slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like disbelief. He studied her face the way you'd study a photograph you hadn't seen in years, searching for a detail you weren't sure was really there. "What's your name?" he asked.
Sophia Bennett.
The moment the word left her mouth, something passed behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or shock, or both. His jaw tightened. His hand resting on the table curled slightly, like he was steadying himself against a memory. "Bennett," he repeated quietly, almost to himself.
"Yeah,"
Sophia said, increasingly unsettled by how he was looking at her now, like she was a ghost who'd wandered into the wrong building.
Is that a problem?"
He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket, placed a folded bill on the table that was easily worth more than her entire night's tips combined, and stood up without touching his drink. "Thank you for the hug, Sophia Bennett," he said, voice low. "You have no idea what you just gave me." And before she could ask what that meant, before she could even process the strange finality in his voice, he was walking out the door, his men falling into step behind him like shadows returning to their source. Sophia stood there in the middle of the bar, apron still half untied in her hand, staring at the door long after it had swung shut behind him. She had no way of knowing that the man who just left was Leon Moretti, one of the most feared and powerful crime bosses in the country. And she had absolutely no idea that her name had just unlocked a promise made 15 years ago, a promise her own mother had taken to her grave. Leon Moretti didn't sleep that night. He sat in the back of his car long after it pulled into the private garage beneath his penthouse, staring at nothing, replaying the woman's face over and over. Sophia Bennett. The surname alone had cracked something open in him that he'd spent 15 years sealing shut. It couldn't be a coincidence. Bennett wasn't a common enough name, not in this city, not after everything that had happened. But coincidences had fooled him before, and he wasn't a man who built decisions on hope. He needed facts. By 7 the next morning, he was in his office on the top floor of Moretti Holdings, a glass-walled room that overlooked the financial district and gave no hint of the empire that actually ran beneath its polished floors. His longtime investigator, Marcus, stood across from his desk, notepad already in hand. Marcus had worked for Leon for over a decade. He knew when his boss's voice carried an edge that meant business, and he knew when it carried something else entirely. This was something else. "I need everything on a woman named Sophia Bennett," Leon said. "Works at a bar downtown, Hutch's, on Lansing Street. Background check, financials, the usual." "Family history, specifically her mother." Leon paused, his fingers tightening slightly on the edge of his desk. "And Marcus, I want this done clean. No surveillance near her home, no following her, no talking to her co-workers or friends. Public records only. I don't want her to feel watched, and I don't want her life disturbed in any way. Are we clear?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, but didn't question it. In 10 years, he'd never heard Leon Moretti ask for restraint on an investigation. Usually, it was the opposite. Dig deeper, push harder, leave no stone unturned regardless of who got hurt in the process. This felt different, and different made Marcus uneasy in a way he couldn't quite name. "I'll have something by this afternoon," he said, and left. Across town, in a small apartment above a laundromat, Sophia was telling her best friend Renee the entire bizarre story over reheated coffee.
"So you hugged a guy on a dare, and his bodyguards almost tackled you," Renee said, laughing so hard she nearly choked.
"It's not funny, Renee. It was terrifying. 1 second everyone's laughing at the bar, the next there's 3 guys ready to do who knows what, and then he just—" Sophia waved her hand vaguely.
"He just looked at me like he'd seen a ghost, and he asked for my name, and when I told him, he looked even worse."
"Maybe he thought he was someone else."
"That's what I figured. Some ex he wasn't over, or a stalker situation, or—"
Sophia shook her head.
"I don't know. He left a $100 bill on the table and just walked out. Didn't even touch his drink."
Renee whistled low. "Rich, mysterious, and haunted by your face. Sounds like the start of a romance novel."
"Sounds like the start of me never going back to that section of the bar again,"
Sophia said. though some small, stubborn part of her couldn't stop replaying his expression. Not predatory, not threatening, but almost wounded. Like she'd accidentally reopened something in him just by existing. She didn't think about it again until the end of her shift, when the strangeness of the night faded into the exhaustion of carrying trays and refilling glasses. By the time she got home, she'd half convinced herself it really had been a case of mistaken identity. A man grieving someone who looked nothing like her at all, probably. She had no idea that, at that exact moment, a file was landing on Leon Moretti's desk that would change both their lives. Marcus returned just after 4 in the afternoon, manila folder in hand, expression unusually careful. Sophia Bennett, 32, born and raised in this city. Father unknown, raised by her mother. No criminal record, no major debts, works 2 jobs to stay afloat. He paused before continuing. Her mother was Margaret Bennett, passed away 8 years ago, cancer. Leon's hand stilled on his desk. Margaret Bennett worked as an emergency room nurse, Marcus continued, flipping a page, at St. Adeline's Memorial, worked there for over 20 years before she passed. The name hit Leon like a physical blow. St. Adeline's, 15 years ago, the night that had nearly ended his life, and quietly began the slow unraveling of everything he thought he wanted from it. St. Adeline's, he repeated, voice barely above a whisper. That mean something to you? Marcus asked, watching his boss's face shift in a way he'd genuinely never witnessed before. Not anger, not calculation, but something closer to grief, cracking through years of careful control. Leon didn't answer immediately. He was somewhere else entirely, back in a sterile hospital room 15 years ago. Blood soaking through a makeshift bandage, a nurse's steady hands working over him, while sirens of his own enemies echoed somewhere outside. That's all, Marcus, he finally said. Thank you. Marcus left without another word, sensing this was no longer a conversation he was part of. Alone in his office, Leon opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he never touched, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper he'd carried for 15 years without ever throwing away, and without ever finding the person it was meant for. Until now. The paper in Leon's hand was soft at the edges now, worn from years of being unfolded and refolded in moments of doubt. It wasn't a letter, it wasn't even a full sentence, just 6 words, written in a nurse's quick, looping handwriting. Leave behind a life worth living. He hadn't looked at it in months. He didn't need to. He could recite it from memory, the way some men recited prayers. 15 years ago, Leon Moretti was 20 years old and bleeding out on a gurney in the emergency room of St. Adeline's Memorial Hospital. He'd been stabbed twice, once in the shoulder, once dangerously close to his ribs, during a dispute that had nothing to do with him directly and everything to do with the empire his father had built and was grooming him to inherit. He remembered the sirens of his own men outside, remembered the panic in their voices as they half-carried him through the hospital doors, remembered someone shouting his last name like it was a warning rather than an identity. Most hospitals in this city knew the Moretti name. Most staff, when they heard it, either fled the room or moved a little too carefully, a little too nervously, aware that treating a Moretti wrong could have consequences far beyond a malpractice suit. Margaret Bennett didn't do either. She was maybe 45 at the time, sharp-eyed, steady-handed, with the kind of calm that came from 20 years of seeing the worst nights of strangers' lives. When she pulled back the blood-soaked shirt and saw the wound, she didn't ask who had done this or why. She didn't ask if it was safe to treat him. She simply got to work, hands moving with practiced precision, voice low and even as she talked him through what she was doing. "You're going to be fine," she told him, "but you need to stay still, and you need to stop trying to look tough. I've seen tougher men than you cry over a paper cut." Despite the pain, despite the fear pulsing through him that someone might walk in and finish what the attack had started, Leon had almost laughed. Over the following days, as he recovered under a false name his father's people had arranged, Margaret was the only person who treated him like an ordinary patient. She didn't fawn over him. She didn't fear him. She scolded him for pulling at his stitches, brought him real food instead of hospital trays when she could manage it, and talked to him about nothing important. Weather, bad television, her daughter, who was apparently obsessed with a cartoon about talking dogs. It was the first time in years Leon had felt like a person instead of an heir to violence. When he was finally well enough to leave, he tried to repay her. He had an envelope prepared, more money than she'd make in 5 years of nursing, and he placed it on her desk with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of believing money solved everything. Margaret pushed it back across the desk without even opening it.
"I don't want your money," she said.
"Everyone wants the money. I'm not everyone." She studied him for a long moment, the same steady look she'd given him on his first night in her care.
"You know what I want instead?
"What?"
I want you to promise me something."
Her voice softened, but there was steel underneath it.
"If you truly want to repay me someday, don't do it with money. Leave behind a life that creates more people in hospital beds. Be someone who builds instead of someone who breaks."
Leon had stared at her, 20 years old and already deep enough into his father's world to know that promise was nearly impossible to keep. But something about the way she said it, not as a demand but as a quiet, unwavering belief that he could be different, made him nod. "I promise," he said. She'd smiled then, the first real smile he remembered from those days, and written those 6 words on a scrap of paper before pressing it into his hand. "Leave behind a life worth living. Don't lose this," she told him, "and don't lose yourself either." He'd meant to come back. He'd meant to find her again once he was free of the obligations that bound him to his father's empire, to show her he'd kept his word. But his father's death came faster than expected, dragging Leon into full control of the organization before he'd had the chance to even consider walking away. Years passed. The promise sat folded in a drawer, untouched but never forgotten, while Leon told himself there would be time later, once things were stable, once he could finally leave without consequence. Once. He searched for her eventually, quietly, the way a man searches for something he's afraid to actually find. He learned only that Margaret Bennett had left St. Adeline's years earlier, and that hospital records, by policy, didn't track where former staff relocated to. He never knew she had passed away from illness years later, in a small apartment above a laundromat, with a daughter at her bedside, who had no idea her mother once held a promise from one of the most powerful men in the city. Until last night, in a crowded bar, when that daughter had hugged him on a dare and said her name was Bennett, and the 15-year search Leon had quietly given up on had ended without him even trying. 2 days passed before Leon decided how he wanted to approach her. He'd considered a dozen different ways, sending a car to bring her to his office, having Marcus arrange an introduction through mutual acquaintances, even simply showing up at Hutch's again and asking her to talk. Every option felt wrong in some way, too calculated, too much like the way he handled everything else in his life. Business deals, negotiations, problems to be solved with leverage and timing. This wasn't a problem to be solved. This was a debt 15 years in the making, owed to a woman who'd never once asked him for anything in return. So instead, he did something he hadn't done in years. He found out which bookstore cafe Sophia visited on her 1 weekday off, the small place 2 blocks from her apartment, where, according to the careful, distant research Marcus had gathered, she liked to read on Wednesday mornings before her evening shift. And he simply went there himself, ordered a coffee, and waited for what would look, to anyone watching, like an accident. Sophia noticed him the moment she walked in. It was hard not to. He looked just as out of place here as he had at the bar, sitting near the window with a paperback he clearly wasn't reading, dressed simply this time, no suit, just a dark sweater that somehow still managed to look expensive. Her first instinct was to turn around and leave. Her second instinct, stronger and more stubborn, was to march straight up to his table. "Are you following me?" she asked, arms crossed. Leon looked up, and something in his expression eased at the sight of her. Not surprise, but relief, like he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of directness. "No," he said. "I'll admit it's not entirely a coincidence that I'm here, but I'm not following you. I wanted to talk to you, and I didn't think showing up at your work again was the right way to do it." "So you found out where I get coffee instead? That's so much better." "It's not as bad as it sounds. I asked someone to find out your name and your mother's profession, that's all. I haven't been near your apartment, your friends, or anything else." He gestured to the seat across from him. "I owe you an explanation, and an apology for how strange the other night must have felt. Will you sit?" Sophia hesitated, every reasonable instinct telling her to walk away from a man who openly admitted to having people investigate her. But there was something underneath his words that didn't match the unease she expected to feel. An honesty, almost painfully direct, that made her curious despite herself. She sat. "My name is Leon," he said. "Leon Moretti. I run a number of businesses in this city. Real estate, logistics, a few other things." It wasn't a lie, exactly, just an incomplete truth. And even as he said it, something in him resisted the omission. But he wasn't ready, not yet, to hand her the whole weight of who he really was. 15 years ago, your mother saved my life. I've spent a long time trying to find her again, and I never did. When you said your name was Bennett, I hoped that I'd finally have the chance to thank her family, even if I was too late to thank her." Sophia's irritation faded into something quieter. "She passed away 8 years ago," she said. "Cancer." "I know. I'm sorry." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable so much as necessary. Two people processing the strange thread that had pulled them together across 15 years and one ordinary dare. "What did she do for you?" Sophia finally asked. Leon told her a version of the truth, that he'd been badly hurt, that her mother had treated him with more kindness than his money or name had earned, that she'd refused payment and asked instead for a promise he'd spent years trying to keep. He didn't mention the stabbing had come from a rival gang. He didn't mention his father's empire. He simply let the story exist as what mattered most. A nurse who'd seen a frightened young man instead of a dangerous name and had asked nothing of him except to become someone better. "That sounds like her," Sophia said softly, eyes shining. "She used to say things like that all the time, that everyone deserved one honest chance, even if they didn't deserve a second one." "She gave me more than one chance, I think," Leon admitted. "I'm still trying to earn it." They talked for nearly 2 hours after that, well past the point where either of them had intended to leave. Sophia found herself telling him about growing up with a single mother who worked double shifts, about the years of feeling invisible in rooms full of people, about the particular loneliness of being surrounded by customers every night and going home to an empty apartment. Leon, in turn, spoke carefully but honestly about losing his father young, about the weight of responsibilities he'd never asked for, about regrets he didn't name specifically but clearly carried like stones in his chest. By the time Sophia finally stood to leave for her shift, something had shifted between them. Not romance yet, not quite, but the unmistakable beginning of a friendship neither of them had expected, and neither of them was ready to walk away from. "Can I see you again?" Leon asked. Sophia smiled, surprising herself with how easily the answer came. "Yeah," she said. "I'd like that." She had no idea how much of the truth he was still keeping folded away, the way he'd once kept her mother's promise, close to his chest and not yet ready to be shared. The weeks that followed fell into an easy, unexpected rhythm. Leon would meet Sophia at the bookstore cafe on her days off, sometimes joined by long walks through the city afterward, conversations stretching from her favorite childhood memories to his careful, half-finished thoughts about a life he wished he'd built differently. He never brought gifts. He never tried to impress her with money. He simply showed up, listened,
and let her talk, which was somehow more disarming than anything wealth could have offered. Sophia found herself looking forward to those days more than she wanted to admit. One quiet afternoon, while searching through a closet for old photographs to send her cousin for a family reunion slideshow, Sophia pulled down a worn shoebox she hadn't opened since her mother's funeral. Inside were the usual things: old photographs, a few pieces of cheap jewelry, a stack of greeting cards tied together with string. And tucked at the very bottom, beneath everything else, was an envelope.
It was old, the paper slightly yellowed, sealed shut and addressed in her mother's familiar looping handwriting, not to a name, just 6 words across the front. To the man who kept his promise. Sophia sat frozen on the floor of her childhood bedroom, the envelope trembling slightly in her hands. She had no idea who it was meant for. Her mother had never mentioned any promise to her, not once in 32 years, not even in the quiet, vulnerable conversations they'd shared during her final months of illness. She turned the envelope over in her hands, debating whether to open it. It felt like trespassing on something private, something her mother had clearly intended to deliver herself and never had the chance to. She set it aside on her dresser instead, unopened, promising herself she'd figure out what to do with it later, though some quiet, instinctive part of her already wondered if it had something to do with the strange, intense way Leon's eyes had gone distant whenever her mother's name came up. She didn't know yet how close that instinct was to the truth. Across the city, Leon sat in his private lawyer's office, dealing with an entirely different kind of discovery. "There's something in your father's old estate files you should see," his lawyer, a careful, graying man named Walter, who'd served the Moretti family for over 2 decades, said as he slid a folder across the desk. "It came up while we were finalizing some of the foundation paperwork you requested last month." Leon opened the folder, expecting routine financial documents. Instead, he found records of an anonymous scholarship fund, established roughly 12 years earlier, dedicated to supporting nursing students who couldn't otherwise afford their education. The fund's contact information led to a now closed account, managed quietly through a small community foundation. "I don't understand," Leon said. "Why is this in my father's files?" "It's not your father's fund," Walter clarified. "It was routed through one of his charitable foundations as a pass-through, likely without his direct knowledge. These things happened more than he'd admit. But the original benefactor's name is listed in the founding documents." He tapped the page. "Margaret Bennett." Leon stared at the name, something tightening in his chest. "She funded this anonymously?" he asked. "For 12 years. Looks that way. Modest contributions, regular, every quarter, until her passing 8 years ago. Never publicized, never took credit." Walter studied his employer carefully. "You knew her?" "She saved my life once," Leon said quietly. "I'm only now starting to understand how many other lives she touched without anyone knowing." He sat with that thought long after Walter left the room. Margaret hadn't just saved one reckless young man from a hospital bed and asked for a promise in return. She'd spent years quietly funding the kind of future she'd wanted for people who needed it, never seeking recognition, never asking for thanks. The scholarship was just one piece of something larger, a life built entirely around small, unseen acts of generosity. It made the weight of his unfulfilled promise feel heavier than ever. That evening, his uncle Victor, his father's younger brother, who'd run significant portions of the organization's more dangerous operations for over 2 decades, arrived at his office unannounced, clearly aware that something had shifted in Leon's behavior over recent weeks. "You've been distracted," Victor said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Leon's desk like he still owned a piece of the company. "Missed 2 meetings with the shipping contacts. Turned down the deal with Renner's people. People are starting to talk." "I've had other priorities," Leon said evenly. "Other priorities." Victor's voice carried a dangerous edge beneath its casual tone. "Is this about the waitress? I've heard the talk, Leon. A waitress. Out of every woman in this city, you're spending your evenings with a bar waitress while business slips through your fingers?" "Her name is Sophia," Leon said, his voice gaining a sharpness that made Victor pause. And what I do with my time outside this office is not your concern. It becomes my concern when it threatens everything your father built. Victor leaned forward. I don't know what's gotten into you these past weeks, but whatever ideas you're entertaining about walking away from this life, don't. This empire doesn't run on sentiment. It runs on strength, and right now, you're starting to look weak. Leon held his uncle's gaze, steady and unflinching. Then maybe it's time the empire changes, he said quietly. Because I'm not interested in being strong the way my father was strong anymore. Victor's jaw tightened, and he left without another word, but the warning in his eyes was unmistakable, a silent promise that he would not stand by quietly while Leon dismantled everything he'd spent his life building. Neither Leon nor Sophia yet realized how closely their separate discoveries were about to collide. Her mother's hidden letter, his mother's hidden generosity, both converging toward a truth neither of them was fully prepared for. Leon decided that night, after Victor left his office, that he couldn't keep walking the careful line he'd drawn between honesty and omission. He'd told Sophia about a debt, about a promise, about businesses that were technically true, but deliberately vague. He hadn't told her what those businesses actually were, or what name truly sat beneath the polished version of himself he'd been presenting at their quiet meetings. He thought about Margaret's journal entry he hadn't read yet, about the scholarship she'd funded in silence for 12 years, about a woman who'd believed people could change without ever demanding proof of it. If he wanted to honor that kind of faith, he couldn't keep building this friendship, whatever it was becoming, on a foundation with a hole in it. He called Sophia the next morning and asked if she'd walk with him through the botanical garden near the edge of downtown, a quiet, half-forgotten place neither of them had ever mentioned before. She agreed without hesitation, mistaking the request for nothing more than another peaceful afternoon together. The garden was nearly empty when they arrived, rows of late-blooming flowers swaying gently under an overcast sky that threatened rain without quite committing to it. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, past stone benches and a small fountain, before Leon finally stopped beneath a wide, leaning willow tree. I need to tell you something, he said, and I need you to let me finish before you respond, because it's not easy to say, and I'm afraid if you stop me halfway through, I won't find the courage to finish. Sophia's stomach tightened at the seriousness in his voice. Okay, she said quietly. I'm listening. The businesses I told you about, the real estate, the logistics, they're real, they exist, but they're not the whole truth, and the omission was deliberate, because I was afraid of exactly what's about to happen. He took a breath. My father built an organization that operated far outside the law. Extortion, businesses used to launder money earned through violence. When he died, I inherited control of it. I am, by any honest definition, the head of an organized crime syndicate. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than anything Sophia had expected. She felt the ground shift slightly beneath her. The easy comfort of the past few weeks suddenly recontextualized into something she didn't know how to process. The men at the bar, she said slowly, piecing it together. The bodyguards, the way everyone went still. Yes. And the night you got hurt 15 years ago, the reason my mother treated you, that wasn't some accident, was it? No, Leon admitted. It was an attack tied to a conflict within my father's world. Your mother never knew the details, I never told her, and I'm grateful every day that she treated me without needing to know. Sophia took a step back, her arms wrapping instinctively around herself despite the mild weather. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve honesty, he said. Because your mother believed people could become better, and I want to honor that, not by hiding who I was, but by showing you who I'm trying to become. I can't do that while lying to you about the most important part of my life. The most important part, Sophia repeated, a bitter edge creeping into her voice despite her attempt to stay calm. You've been spending weeks with me,
telling me about regrets and loneliness and second chances, while leaving out the fact that you run something built on hurting people. People being shipped, extorted, threatened. That's not some abstract regret, Leon. That's real harm, happening to real people, right now, while we sit in bookstore cafes talking about books. You're right, Leon said, not flinching from the accusation. And I won't defend it. I've spent 15 years telling myself I'd change things eventually, and eventually never came. Meeting you, being reminded of the promise I made your mother, it's forced me to stop putting it off. So this is about timing? About me being some kind of wake-up call? No. This is about you deserving to know exactly who you've been spending time with, so that whatever happens next, it happens with the truth between us instead of around it. Sophia stood silent for a long moment, the wind picking up slightly, scattering a few early leaves across the garden path. Everything she thought she'd understood about him, his quiet kindness, his careful attentiveness, the gentle way he'd spoken about her mother. None of it felt like a lie exactly, but all of it now felt incomplete in a way that made her chest ache. "I need to go," she said finally, her voice quieter than she expected. "Sophia, please, I just need time." She turned and walked away without looking back, leaving Leon standing alone beneath the willow tree, the first heavy drops of rain finally beginning to fall. He didn't follow her. He didn't call. For 3 days, then 4, then a full week, he gave her exactly the space she'd asked for, even as every instinct in him, the instinct of a man used to controlling outcomes, screamed at him to fix it, to explain further, to make sure she understood. But some promises, he reminded himself, weren't meant to be forced. Margaret hadn't forced him into anything 15 years ago. She'd simply planted a seed and trusted it to grow on its own. All he could do now was wait, and hope the seed she'd planted in her daughter carried the same patience her mother once had. Sophia didn't call Renee for 3 days. She didn't call anyone. She moved through her shifts at Hutch's like a person underwater, smiling at customers out of habit, refilling glasses without really seeing them, while her mind circled the same unanswered question over and over. How could someone who'd shown her nothing but gentleness be the same man capable of running an empire built on fear? It was Renee, eventually, who pushed her toward an answer. "You said your mom worked with a doctor for years, right? The one who used to send you guys a Christmas card every year?" "Dr. Whitfield," Sophia said. "Retired now. Why?" "If anyone knew your mom's secrets, it'd be the person who worked beside her for 2 decades. You're sitting here driving yourself crazy guessing what she would have thought about all this. So stop guessing. Go ask someone who actually knew her." Sophia hadn't seen Dr. Whitfield since her mother's funeral, but the address was easy enough to find. A small charity clinic on the edge of town where he still volunteered twice a week despite being well into his 70s. He recognized her instantly, his weathered face breaking into a warm, sad smile. "Sophia Bennett, you look more like your mother every year." He led her into a cramped back office cluttered with old medical journals and faded photographs. "What brings you here?" She told him an edited version of the truth, that she'd recently learned things about her mother she hadn't known, about a promise made to a stranger, about a scholarship fund kept secret for over a decade. Dr. Whitfield listened without much surprise, nodding slowly as she spoke. "That sounds exactly like Margaret," he said. "She never did anything for credit, not once, in 20 years of working together." He rose, moved to a cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a small stack of worn notebooks tied together with a faded ribbon. She used to write things down, thoughts about patients, about the job, about life in general. After she passed, her things were boxed up and some of it ended up here, since she didn't have much family left to claim it besides you, and you were grieving too much at the time to go through everything. He handed the notebooks to her gently. "I think it's time these went home." Sophia spent that night curled on her couch, working through her mother's handwriting page by page,
a box of tissues steadily emptying beside her. Some entries were mundane, complaints about hospital bureaucracy, notes about difficult patients, small joys like a particularly good cup of coffee on a long shift. But scattered throughout, certain entries stood out, underlined or starred in ways that suggested Margaret had returned to reread them. One entry, dated almost exactly 15 years earlier, made Sophia's breath catch. Treated a young man tonight who's clearly mixed up in something dangerous. Wouldn't say much, but I could see it in his eyes. Not evil, just lost. Reminded me that nobody is born wanting to hurt people. Something breaks first. I told him to make a promise instead of taking my payment. We'll see if he keeps it. I believe he will, eventually. Some people just need someone to believe they're capable of better before they can believe it themselves. Further entries, scattered across the years, occasionally returned to the thought, almost like a quiet hope she carried privately. Wonder if he ever thinks about that promise. I think about him sometimes. Not worried, exactly. Just curious whether the seed took root.
And then, near the final pages, written when her illness had clearly progressed far enough that her handwriting had grown shaky and uneven. If I don't get the chance to see it through, I hope whoever finds these pages understands something I've believed my whole life. Changing one person can ripple further than you'd ever expect. One life, set right, can save 100 others down the line. I never needed thanks for any of it. I just needed to believe it mattered. I think it did. Sophia sat with the journal open on her lap for a long time after that, tears falling freely now, not from grief exactly, but from something more complicated. The slow, painful realization that her mother had seen something in Leon 15 years ago that Sophia herself had only glimpsed in fragments over the past few weeks. Not a monster wearing kindness as a disguise, but a frightened young man who'd been waiting, maybe his whole life, for someone to believe he could be more than what he'd been born into. She thought of the unopened envelope still sitting on her dresser. To the man who kept his promise. Her mother had written those words with faith, not certainty. Faith that somewhere out there, the seed she'd planted would eventually grow. Meanwhile, across the city, that growth was proving far more difficult than Leon had anticipated. Over the past week, he'd begun quietly unwinding several of the organization's illegal operations, shutting down 2 smuggling routes, transferring control of a laundering front to a legitimate logistics firm, severing ties with contacts who'd worked with his father for decades. Each decision was met with resistance, some subtle, some not. Long-time associates who'd built their lives around the old ways grew suspicious, then hostile, as word spread that Leon Moretti was dismantling pieces of an empire that had taken his father 30 years to build. Victor's warnings grew sharper with each passing day, no longer veiled threats, but open confrontations in board meetings, accusations of weakness, reminders of loyalty owed to the family name. Leon absorbed each one without flinching, holding on to a single thought that steadied him through every difficult conversation. Somewhere in this city, a woman was reading her mother's words and deciding whether the man who'd made that promise was capable of finally keeping it. He didn't know yet that she already believed he was. Sophia called Leon on a Tuesday evening, exactly 9 days after walking away from him in the botanical garden. "I read my mother's journals," she said, voice steady despite the emotion underneath it. "I understand now. Not all of it, probably not even most of it, but enough to know I don't want to walk away from this without giving you a chance to show me who you're actually trying to become." Leon let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for over a week. "I meant everything I told you," he said, "and I've already started proving it, whether or not you came back." He told her, carefully and honestly this time, about the operations he'd begun shutting down, about the resistance he was facing from within his own organization, about Victor's mounting fury at watching decades of his brother's legacy dismantled piece by piece. Sophia listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said only, Then let me help, somehow. Not with the dangerous parts, but with what comes after.
What came after began 3 weeks later, when Leon made the most consequential decision of his life. He'd spent those weeks quietly compiling records, financial trails, falsified shipping manifests, evidence of money laundering routed through legitimate-seeming businesses, documentation that, if released publicly, would expose corruption running through several key figures in his organization, including, unavoidably, parts of his own father's old network. Walter, his lawyer, had urged caution at every step, warning him that handing this kind of material to legal authorities, even carefully and selectively, was something that couldn't be undone once it started.
"Once this moves, you can't control where it ends," Walter said in their final meeting before Leon made his decision. "It could expose you too, depending on how deep investigators dig." "I know," Leon said. "That's the point. I'm not interested in protecting myself from consequences anymore. I just want it to end the right way, through the law, not through more violence." He handed the evidence over to a team of legal advisors with strict instructions. Cooperate fully with authorities, accept whatever consequences came his way honestly, and ensure the individuals most directly responsible for the organization's most damaging crimes, the violent enforcement operations, the worst of what his father had built, faced real accountability. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Victor showed up at Leon's penthouse late one night, face flushed with fury, flanked by 2 men Leon didn't recognize. "You handed us over," Victor snarled. 30 years of my brother's work, and you handed it to lawyers like it was nothing." "I handed over evidence of crimes," Leon said calmly, standing his ground despite the very real danger in the room. "Not the legitimate businesses, not the people who built lives the right way, just the parts that were never going to lead anywhere except more bodies, more ruined families, more debts like the one I've spent 15 years trying to repay. You think loyalty doesn't matter anymore? You think the men who've worked for this family for decades will just accept this?" "Some won't," Leon admitted. "But I've spoken with most of our longtime associates over the past month." Victor, quietly, carefully. More of them than you'd expect are tired of looking over their shoulders too. They want stability, legitimate businesses, lives that don't end in prison or a bullet. I'm offering them that. You're offering them more of the same fear my father ran on for 30 years. Victor's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the 2 men beside him, a silent, dangerous question hanging in the room. But something unexpected happened then, the twist Leon himself hadn't fully anticipated. One of Victor's own men, a long-time enforcer named Castellano, who'd served the organization since Leon's father's earliest days, stepped quietly between them. "Enough, Victor," Castellano said. "I've buried 3 friends in this business over the years. My own son's never met half his family because I was too afraid to bring him around. If the boy wants out, and he's willing to take the fall for it honestly instead of running, I'm done fighting that." The room fell silent. Victor's authority, built on decades of fear rather than respect, cracked visibly in that moment, exposed as far more fragile than he'd ever let himself believe. He left without another word that night, and within 2 months, facing mounting legal pressure and dwindling support from associates who'd quietly begun transitioning toward legitimate work, Victor accepted a generous severance and disappeared from the city entirely. Not defeated by violence, but by the simple, devastating truth that even within an empire built on fear, people were tired of being afraid. While Leon dismantled his father's darker legacy piece by piece, Sophia began building something new from the wreckage. Using funds Leon had legally and transparently donated, earnings now fully separated from any illegal source, verified by his own legal team specifically to ensure the money was clean, she established the Margaret Bennett Community Health Foundation, dedicated to funding nursing scholarships and free clinics in underserved neighborhoods across the city. It wasn't a grand gesture meant to erase 15 years of harm. It was something smaller and somehow more powerful. The quiet continuation of a promise Margaret Bennett had made to a frightened young man in an emergency room.
now growing into something neither of them could have predicted. Slowly, cautiously, both their families and closest friends began to soften toward the relationship neither Leon nor Sophia had set out looking for. Renee, after weeks of skepticism, finally admitted over dinner that she'd never seen Sophia look more certain of anything in her life. Even Walter, normally reserved, told Leon quietly one evening that he hadn't seen this kind of peace in his eyes since before his father's death. Their relationship wasn't built on power or money or the desperate need to prove something to the world. It was built simply and honestly on a promise finally being kept. 8 months after a dare in a crowded bar set everything in motion, the doors of the newly renovated Margaret Bennett Community Medical Center opened to the public for the first time. It had once been a struggling clinic on the edge of downtown, the kind of place that ran on donated equipment and overworked staff, serving a neighborhood that couldn't afford much else. Now it stood transformed, clean, modern, fully staffed, with a new wing dedicated entirely to training nursing students through scholarships funded by the foundation Sophia had built in her mother's name. Free clinics ran 3 days a week. A care unit occupied the second floor, something the neighborhood had been petitioning for unsuccessfully for over a decade. Above the main entrance, carved into a marble plaque that caught the afternoon sunlight, were the words Sophia had chosen herself, pulled directly from her mother's journal. Kindness asks for nothing, but it can change everything. The dedication ceremony drew a modest crowd: hospital staff, foundation donors, a handful of local reporters covering what they understood only as a heartwarming story about a community foundation, with no knowledge of the empire that had quietly funded its beginning, or the criminal underworld it had risen from the ashes of. Leon had insisted on that. The foundation would stand entirely on its own merit, clean and verifiable, with no shadow of his past attached to its name. Whatever debt he still carried, he wanted it repaid without staining the very thing it was meant to honor. Sophia stood near the entrance in a simple blue dress, watching nurses and doctors move through the building with quiet pride, watching children from the neighborhood peer curiously through the windows. Renee stood beside her, suspiciously misty-eyed for someone who'd spent the better part of a year teasing Sophia mercilessly about her mysterious, rich boyfriend. "She'd be proud of you," Renee said softly. "Both of you, actually." Sophia smiled, throat tight. "I think she already knew this would happen, somehow. She wrote about it in her journals, hoping the seed would take root. I don't think she ever doubted it would. She just didn't know when." Leon arrived a short while later, dressed simply, without the entourage of bodyguards that had once followed his every step. Over the past months, as legal proceedings against the organization's most damaging operations moved forward, as Victor's network crumbled and longtime associates transitioned into legitimate work, Leon's life had grown quieter in a way that suited him far better than the constant vigilance of his old one. He still faced consequences: fines, ongoing legal scrutiny, the slow, uncomfortable process of separating himself publicly from his father's legacy. But none of it carried the weight it once might have, because for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't carrying it alone. He found Sophia near the marble plaque, reading the words etched above the entrance for what was probably the 10th time that day. "I used to think I'd repay this debt with money," he said quietly, standing beside her. "I had it all planned out 15 years ago. Find her, hand her more than she could ever need, consider the promise fulfilled." He shook his head slightly. "I didn't understand back then that she never wanted the money repaid. She wanted me repaid, into someone different than the man who walked into that emergency room." "And now?" Sophia asked. "Now I think I finally understand what she was asking for." He looked toward the building, toward the nurses and doctors moving purposefully through halls that hadn't existed in this form a year ago. Not redemption through wealth, just a life that creates a little less suffering than it would have otherwise. A life that, somewhere down the line, helps build something instead of breaking it. Sophia reached into her purse then and pulled out the envelope she'd carried with her for weeks, finally opened, the letter inside read and reread until the creases had softened from handling. She hadn't shown it to Leon yet, waiting for the right moment, and somehow, standing beneath her mother's words carved into marble, this felt like it. "I think this was always meant for you," she said, handing him the letter. Leon unfolded it carefully. Margaret's familiar handwriting filled the page, written, based on the date at the top, only months before she'd passed away. To the man who kept his promise. If you're reading this, then somehow, against the odds I always believed in anyway, you found your way to the people I left behind. I never doubted you would change. I just hoped I'd live long enough to see it, though I suspect I won't. Whatever you've built by the time you read this, I hope it's something that makes the world a little gentler than the one you came from. Thank you for trusting a stranger's faith in you 15 years ago, when you had every reason not to. The debt was never about repayment, it was about becoming. I believe you have. Leon read the letter twice, his hand trembling slightly by the end, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were wet in a way Sophia had never seen before. Not the calculated stillness of the man in the bar, not even the careful honesty of the man in the garden, but something entirely unguarded. "She believed in me before I believed in myself," he said quietly.
"She believed in everyone like that," Sophia said. "That's just who she was." Standing together beneath the marble plaque, surrounded by the quiet hum of a building built from a promise made 15 years earlier, Sophia finally understood something she hadn't fully grasped until this exact moment. That the dare in the bar, the hug that had nearly gotten her tackled by bodyguards, hadn't been the beginning of their story at all. It had simply been the moment two lives, already connected by her mother's quiet, unwavering faith, finally found their way back to each other. And for the first time in 15 years, Leon Moretti felt the weight he'd carried since that night in the emergency room finally lift. Not because the debt had been paid in money or in grand gestures, but because he had, at last, become the person Margaret Bennett always believed he could be.